She won't understand a single word I say, Richard Whitmore said loudly, smirking as he pushed the glass of water aside like the entire room existed beneath his attention. The billionaire didn't even lower his voice, as if the waitress standing just 10 feet away was invisible to his world. People like her never do, he added, glancing at his assistant with a quiet confidence that carried more arrogance than humor. The words sliced through the elegant silence of the Manhattan restaurant, where crystal glasses shimmered under soft gold lighting, and every table seemed trained not to react too quickly. Aaliyah Johnson stood still at the edge of the table, holding her notepad close to her chest, her expression calm in a way that didn't match the tension forming in the air. Richard didn't look at her when he spoke again, this time shifting into fluent French, sharp and deliberate, the kind of language used in boardrooms and private negotiations, not casual dinner conversation. Bring the wine list in its original pairing format, he said, then leaned back as if testing an invisible boundary. One of his business partners chuckled under his breath, already assuming the joke had landed. But Aaliyah didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink in confusion. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something only she could fully understand, and the silence that followed stretched longer than anyone expected. Richard noticed it then, the smallest disruption in his control of the room, the way she wasn't reacting the way she was supposed to. He tried again, faster this time, slipping into a second language more complex, layered with idioms even most educated listeners would struggle to follow. Still, Aaliyah remained composed, her pen resting lightly against the page, her eyes steady on him like she was waiting for him to finish rather than trying to keep up. Something subtle shifted in Richard's expression. Not concern yet, not doubt, just a flicker of irritation at the possibility that his assumption might not be correct. He turned slightly toward her now, finally acknowledging her presence directly, and repeated the phrase again, slower, as if speaking to someone who simply needed patience rather than intelligence. A few diners nearby began to sense the change in rhythm at the table, the invisible power dynamic bending in a direction no one had expected. Then, without hesitation, Aaliyah responded in perfect French, precise in pronunciation, calm in tone, correcting one of his words so gently it almost sounded polite. The room didn't gasp, didn't move, didn't breathe for a second that felt unusually long, as Richard froze mid-motion, his glass hovering just above the table. Aaliyah didn't smile, didn't assert dominance, didn't celebrate the moment. She simply continued in the same language, answering his original request with clarity and ease, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Richard set the glass down slowly, studying her for the first time not as a waitress but as an unknown variable he had failed to calculate. The arrogance that had filled the space moments ago didn't disappear, but it shifted, cracked slightly under the weight of something unexpected. Aaliyah finally placed her pen down and met his gaze fully, her voice steady when she spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just certain in a way that made the entire table feel smaller. Would you like the wine list in English as well, or should I continue? She asked, and in that moment Richard Whitmore realized the mistake wasn't in what he said, but in what he assumed about who was listening. The silence that followed felt heavier than the glass chandeliers hanging above them, as if the entire restaurant had briefly stopped pretending not to listen. Richard Whitmore did not speak immediately, his fingers resting against the edge of the table, while his eyes stayed fixed on Aaliyah Johnson with a level of attention that had not been there before. Around them, the subtle clinking of silverware resumed in cautious rhythm, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that no one could ignore. Richard finally leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as if recalibrating his assumptions about the world in real time. Interesting, he said at last, though the word carried more analysis than admiration. He glanced toward his assistant, then back at Aaliyah, as if replaying the last minute in his mind to verify it had actually happened. You speak French fluently, he added, not as a question but as an observation that challenged his earlier certainty. Aaliyah simply nodded once, her posture unchanged, her calmness almost unsettling in its consistency. Richard tapped his finger lightly against the table, then switched languages again, this time to German, sharper and more technical, as if increasing difficulty would restore balance to the moment. He spoke quickly, referencing a shipment delay and contractual clause, the kind of language used in high-level negotiations where precision mattered more than politeness. The words flowed across the table like a test rather than a conversation. Aaliyah listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable in a way that made it impossible to tell whether she was processing or simply waiting. When he finished, Richard paused, expecting hesitation, confusion, maybe even an admission of limitation, but instead she responded immediately in fluent German, matching his tone, correcting a subtle misused term with quiet accuracy that landed harder than any argument. The assistant at Richard's side shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that the dynamic at the table had inverted without permission. Richard did not smile this time. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, studying her more carefully as though she were a problem he had failed to classify correctly. "Where did you learn that level of language proficiency?" he asked, his tone still controlled but now carrying something closer to genuine curiosity. Aaliyah hesitated for the first time, just briefly, before answering in English with calm simplicity, explaining that she had studied languages throughout her education while working multiple jobs to support her family, and that language had always been something she treated as structure rather than luxury. Richard listened without interrupting, though his expression tightened slightly at the realization that he had placed her in a category she did not belong to. Around them, the restaurant continued to function, but the world inside their table felt increasingly isolated, as if everything else had moved one step further away. A passing waiter slowed briefly, sensing the shift, then continued on without comment. Richard finally looked away, not out of dismissal but out of recalibration, as if something fundamental in his understanding had been disrupted and required reassembly. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more measured. "You could have corrected me earlier," he said. Aaliyah met his gaze evenly. "You did not ask," she replied simply, and the absence of emotion in her answer carried more weight than confrontation ever could. For the first time since entering the restaurant, Richard Whitmore did not have a response ready, and in that unfamiliar silence, the balance of control in the room no longer belonged entirely to him. The air between Richard Whitmore and Aaliyah Johnson felt different now, no longer shaped by arrogance alone, but by a subtle recalibration of control that neither of them openly acknowledged. Richard sat still for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze lowered toward the untouched wine glass as if its reflection could help him reconstruct the moment he had just experienced. Around them, the restaurant returned to its careful rhythm, but the energy at their table remained suspended, like a conversation paused in the middle of a sentence that no one was sure how to continue. Richard finally exhaled and leaned slightly forward again, this time with less certainty in his posture. "You make it sound like languages are just systems to you," he said, his tone more measured, less dismissive than before. Aaliyah remained composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her presence calm in a way that contrasted sharply with the subtle tension in his voice. "They are systems," she replied simply, as if stating something self-evident rather than impressive. "Pattern, structure, repetition. Once you recognize them, everything becomes predictable." Richard studied her for a moment, his expression tightening not in frustration but in reluctant reassessment. He had spent years in environments where intelligence was measured through credentials, status, and financial success, yet nothing in Aaliyah Johnson's demeanor aligned with the category he had placed her in at first glance. He glanced briefly at her uniform, the simple fabric of her apron, then back at her eyes, searching for inconsistency but found none. "Most people do not think of language that way," he said. Aaliyah nodded once. "Most people are not forced to use it as a way to survive," she answered without emotion, not as a complaint but as a fact shaped by experience. The words settled into the space between them without drama, but their weight changed something in Richard's expression. For the first time, he did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked away toward the distant windows of the restaurant where the lights of Manhattan blurred into a soft glow, as if distance might help him process what he had just heard. His assistant shifted slightly in her seat, unsure whether to speak or remain silent, ultimately choosing silence as Richard raised his hand subtly, signaling for patience. Aaliyah adjusted her notepad slightly, preparing to step away as her duties required, but Richard spoke again before she could move. "Stay a moment," he said, not as an order but as a request that carried less authority than he was used to expressing. She paused, waiting. He leaned back again, folding one hand over the other. "When I spoke earlier," he said slowly, choosing his words with unusual care, "I assumed you would not understand. That assumption was incorrect. Aaliyah did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to exist without rushing to fill it. When she finally spoke, her tone remained steady. Assumptions are usually made before information is complete, she said. Richard gave a faint nod, acknowledging the truth in her words without attempting to defend himself. The restaurant around them continued its quiet flow of conversations and distant clinking of glassware, but their table had become its own contained space of reflection. Richard looked at her again, this time without the layer of certainty that had defined his earlier behavior. "You have worked here long?" he asked. 2 years, she replied. He nodded again as if calculating something internally. There was no judgment in his expression now, only a quiet reconsideration of everything he thought he understood about the people around him. Aaliyah finally took a small step back, signaling the natural end of the exchange, and Richard did not stop her this time. But as she turned slightly to leave, he spoke one last time, his voice lower, almost reflective. "You were right earlier," he said. She paused but did not turn fully back. "I did not ask," he continued. "And that is where I made the mistake." For a brief moment, neither of them moved, and in that stillness, the imbalance that had defined their interaction no longer felt as absolute as it once had. The moment Aaliyah Johnson turned slightly away from the table, the surrounding noise of the restaurant returned in fragments, but Richard Whitmore remained still, his attention no longer anchored in the conversations around him. A quiet shift had begun to form not in the room itself but in the way he perceived it, as if every assumption he had carried into the evening was being gently stripped away one layer at a time. He was about to speak again when another voice entered the space, sharper and more casual, cutting through the softened tension like an interruption that did not ask permission. Daniel Brooks, one of Richard's longtime business associates, leaned back in his chair with a faint smirk, his eyes following Aaliyah as she moved between tables. "I did not realize we were conducting intellectual debates with the service staff tonight," he said lightly, though the tone carried an edge of amusement meant for the table rather than the room. Aaliyah did not react, continuing her work with quiet efficiency, but Richard's expression changed almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes that suggested the comment had landed differently than intended. Daniel continued, unaware of the shift. "It is impressive though, I suppose, when someone memorizes enough phrases to sound convincing." A brief laugh escaped from another guest at the table, but it was restrained, uncertain, as if waiting for permission to continue. Richard did not join in. Instead, he placed his hand flat against the table, a small gesture that immediately reduced the surrounding noise. "That is not what happened," he said calmly, though his voice carried a firmness that silenced the lingering amusement. Daniel raised an eyebrow, surprised at the correction. "You are defending her now?" he asked, his tone half curious, half skeptical. Richard did not answer immediately. His gaze followed Aaliyah for a brief moment as she paused near a nearby table, responding to a guest in fluent Spanish with the same calm precision she had shown earlier. Only then did he turn back to Daniel. "I am correcting an assumption," Richard said evenly. "There is a difference." The words settled heavily, not aggressive, but definitive in a way that subtly altered the atmosphere again. Daniel leaned forward slightly, studying Richard as if recalibrating his understanding of the situation. "You tested her earlier," Daniel said. "French, German. It sounded like you were proving a point." Richard did not deny it. "I was," he replied simply. "And I was wrong in what I believed I would find." Across the room, Aaliyah returned toward their table, setting down a small item they had requested earlier with the same quiet professionalism as before. She did not interrupt the conversation, but her presence alone seemed to sharpen the awareness of everyone seated nearby. Daniel glanced at her again, then back at Richard. "People usually reveal what they are very quickly," he said. "It does not take long to categorize them." Richard exhaled slowly, his attention no longer divided. "That is exactly the problem," he responded. Aaliyah finally met Richard's gaze briefly, not searching for validation, not waiting for approval, simply acknowledging the exchange before stepping away again. The silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable, but reflective, as if the conversation itself had shifted into unfamiliar territory where certainty no longer felt reliable. Daniel leaned back, his earlier confidence slightly diminished. Richard, however, remained focused not on proving a point anymore, but on understanding the weight of what he had already misjudged. And in that realization, the evening no longer felt like a demonstration of status or intellect, but something closer to a quiet confrontation with his own assumptions. The evening had shifted into a quieter rhythm, but beneath the polished surface of the restaurant, something subtle had changed in the way Richard Whitmore moved through the space. He no longer carried the same effortless certainty that had defined him when he first arrived, and even though nothing around him had physically changed, the atmosphere felt different to him now, as if the room itself had become slightly more transparent. Aaliyah Johnson had returned to her duties, moving between tables with the same calm precision, but Richard's attention followed her in moments he did not fully control. When she passed near their table again, he noticed something he had ignored earlier, not just her fluency in languages, but the consistency of her focus, the way she observed before she responded, as if every interaction was processed rather than reacted to. Daniel Brooks, still seated across from Richard, took a sip of his drink and glanced toward the restaurant floor with casual indifference. "You are overthinking this," Daniel said lightly, as if reading Richard's silence. "It is just a waitress who happens to be good with languages. That does not change the bigger picture." Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched as Aaliyah briefly paused at another table, switching effortlessly into Italian to assist a couple who were struggling to communicate their order. The exchange was brief, efficient, and entirely unremarkable to anyone not paying attention, yet to Richard it registered differently now, not as a novelty but as consistency that could not be easily dismissed. "It is not about languages," Richard said finally, his voice lower than before. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Then what is it about?" Richard leaned slightly forward, his hands resting together on the table. For a moment he seemed to search for the right framing of his thoughts, not as a businessman evaluating performance, but as someone reconsidering the validity of his own judgment. "It is about how quickly I categorized her," he said. Daniel gave a faint smile, unconvinced. "You categorized everyone when you walked in here," he replied. Richard did not deny it. That was the part that lingered in his mind now, not the correction itself, but the speed of the assumption, the certainty he had carried without question. Across the room, Aaliyah completed another task and moved toward the service station, her expression unchanged, her focus steady. Richard observed her for a longer moment this time, noticing not performance but discipline, not reaction but control. He realized that nothing about her behavior had required validation from anyone at the table, including him. Daniel followed Richard's gaze and sighed. "Look, Richard, people like her work in places like this for a reason. It is not complicated." The statement was casual, almost dismissive, but it landed differently now. Richard slowly turned his attention back to Daniel, not with confrontation, but with a level of quiet distance that suggested reassessment. "That is exactly what I thought before tonight," Richard said. "And I was wrong about what I thought I understood." Daniel paused, studying him now with more attention. The conversation between them had shifted without announcement, no longer centered on Aaliyah alone, but on the assumptions that surrounded her presence in their world. Richard glanced once more toward the floor, where Aaliyah continued her work without interruption, unaware or unconcerned with the conversation unfolding above her. Yet in Richard's mind, something had already moved, not toward certainty, but away from it, into a space where observation required more humility than judgment. The restaurant had begun to settle into its late evening rhythm, but for Richard Whitmore, nothing about the environment felt ordinary anymore. The conversations around him were still polite, the lighting still soft, the service still precise, yet his attention remained anchored to a single point of observation that no longer felt casual. Aaliyah Johnson moved through the dining floor with the same steady efficiency, but Richard now noticed details he had previously overlooked, not as performance, but as consistency under pressure. Every interaction she handled carried the same calm structure, whether the request was simple or complex, whether the guest was impatient or indifferent. Daniel Brooks, still seated across from Richard, swirled his drink slowly, watching him with growing curiosity. "You have been unusually quiet," Daniel said, his tone light but observant. Richard did not immediately respond. His eyes tracked Aaliyah as she assisted another table, switching seamlessly between English and Spanish without hesitation, adjusting tone and pace based on the guests in front of her. It was not just fluency anymore that Richard was noticing. It was precision, timing, and control that did not match the role he had assigned her in his mind earlier. Quiet is not the correct word, Richard said finally, still watching her movement across the room. Daniel leaned back slightly. Then what is it? He asked. Richard paused, as if evaluating how to translate his thoughts into something that made sense outside of his own internal framework. Reassessment, he said simply. Daniel gave a faint smile, unconvinced but attentive. Of a waitress? Richard turned his gaze briefly toward Daniel, then back to the floor where Aaliyah had stopped momentarily to clarify and order detail with another staff member. Of my assumptions, Richard corrected. The words hung in the space between them, not confrontational, but firm enough to shift the tone of the table. Daniel followed his gaze again and exhaled lightly. You are giving this more weight than it needs, he said. She is good at her job. That is all this is. Richard did not agree immediately. Instead, he observed Aaliyah as she completed the interaction and moved with quiet efficiency toward the service area again. There was no hesitation in her movements, no unnecessary display, no attempt to draw attention to herself, and yet everything she did carried a clarity that Richard now recognized as intentional rather than incidental. Most people assume competence based on position, Richard said after a moment. Daniel raised an eyebrow. And you do not? Richard allowed a brief pause before answering. I used to think position reflected capability, he said. Tonight is showing me that I was confusing the two. Daniel took a slow sip of his drink, studying Richard more carefully now. The conversation had shifted away from casual commentary into something more reflective, something that no longer allowed easy dismissal. Across the room, Aaliyah returned briefly toward the service counter, exchanging a few words with a colleague before continuing her work, unaware that she had become the center of a discussion that extended beyond her presence. Richard watched her for a longer moment, noticing now not just her skill but her restraint, the absence of effort to prove anything to anyone around her. That detail stayed with him longer than anything else that had happened that evening. Daniel finally set his glass down. So what changes now? He asked. Richard did not answer immediately. His attention remained on Aaliyah as she continued moving through the restaurant with the same controlled precision, unaffected by observation or judgment. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. Now, Richard said, I pay closer attention before I decide what something is. The evening had reached a quieter stage, where conversations at each table blended into a low and steady rhythm. Yet for Richard Whitmore, nothing about the environment felt neutral anymore. His attention remained divided in a way he could not fully resolve, not because of distraction, but because of the slow shift taking place in how he interpreted what he saw. Aaliyah Johnson continued moving through the restaurant with consistent precision, responding to guests, coordinating with staff, and maintaining a level of control that no longer fit into the simple category Richard had assigned her earlier that night. Daniel Brooks sat across from him, observing the change in Richard's silence with growing curiosity. You are still thinking about her, Daniel said casually, not as a question but as an observation. Richard did not immediately respond. His eyes briefly followed Aaliyah as she assisted a table near the far end of the room, her movements efficient and deliberate, her expression unchanged even under the subtle pressure of a busy service floor. It is not about her anymore, Richard said finally, his voice measured, quieter than before. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Then what is it about? Richard paused, as if choosing words that would not oversimplify what he was beginning to recognize. It is about accuracy, he said. About how often certainty replaces observation. Daniel gave a faint smile, still skeptical but no longer dismissive. You are making it philosophical now. Richard did not react to the comment. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table, his focus no longer scattered but directed inward. I built my entire approach on pattern recognition, he said calmly. Markets, people, negotiations. Everything is categorized, evaluated, and responded to based on probability. He stopped for a moment, then glanced toward Aaliyah again as she returned briefly to the service counter, speaking softly with a colleague before continuing her route across the floor. But that system only works if the initial classification is correct, he added. Daniel followed his gaze and exhaled lightly. So you are saying you misclassified a waitress, he said, still attempting to keep the tone light. Richard did not accept the framing. I am saying I misclassified a person, he corrected. The emphasis shifted the weight of the conversation. Daniel set his glass down more slowly this time, studying Richard with increased attention. And what makes this one different from all the others you have met? He asked. Richard took a moment before answering. Across the room, Aaliyah paused again to assist a guest, this time adjusting her tone seamlessly as she switched between languages without hesitation or visible effort. It is not that she is different, Richard said. It is that I failed to see what was already consistent in front of me. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful now rather than dismissive. The noise of the restaurant continued around them, but their table felt increasingly isolated from it, as if the conversation had created a separate space within the room. Richard's gaze remained steady on Aaliyah as she completed her task and moved toward another section of the floor. There was no performance in her actions, no indication that she was aware of being observed differently now than before. That absence of reaction itself became the most notable detail to Richard. Most people want to be recognized for what they are good at, Daniel said after a moment. Richard nodded slightly. Yes, he replied. But that assumes they are trying to be recognized at all. A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable but reflective. Daniel looked toward the floor once more, then back at Richard. So what conclusion are you reaching? He asked. Richard did not answer immediately. His attention remained on Aaliyah as she continued working with the same controlled consistency, unaffected by interpretation or assumption. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, without emphasis or conclusion. That observation is not the same as understanding, Richard said, and I have been confusing the two for a long time. The restaurant had begun to settle into its final rhythm of the evening, where conversation softened and movements slowed, yet Richard Whitmore remained unusually still, as if the environment around him had become secondary to the process unfolding within his own thoughts. Daniel Brooks had also stopped speaking for several minutes, watching Richard with a quiet curiosity that no longer carried skepticism but something closer to observation. Across the room, Aaliyah Johnson continued her work with the same calm precision as before, yet Richard no longer viewed her actions as isolated tasks. Instead, he began to recognize a consistency that extended beyond language, beyond surface impression, into something structured and deliberate that he had failed to identify earlier. Daniel finally broke the silence. You have been watching her for almost an hour now, he said, not accusing but noting the pattern. Richard did not immediately respond. His gaze remained fixed on Aaliyah as she assisted a table near the far end of the restaurant, switching seamlessly between English and Spanish without hesitation, adjusting tone, rhythm, and delivery depending on the guest. I am no longer just watching her, Richard said finally, his voice lower than before. Daniel leaned slightly forward. Then what are you doing? Richard paused, choosing his words carefully, not as an executive making a judgment, but as someone reconstructing a belief system. I am correcting something I built without verification, he said. Daniel studied him for a moment, the earlier amusement now replaced with a more serious attention. You are talking like this is more than a misunderstanding, he said. Richard did not look away from Aaliyah as she returned briefly to the service station, exchanging a few words with a colleague before moving again into the floor. It is more than a misunderstanding, Richard replied. It is a structural error in how I interpret people. Daniel raised his eyebrows slightly. That sounds like an overstatement. Richard finally turned his attention back to Daniel. No, he said calmly. It is an understatement of impact. A brief silence followed, one that did not feel empty but instead felt concentrated, as if the conversation had moved beneath the surface of ordinary dialogue. Daniel leaned back, absorbing the shift in Richard's tone. So what changed? He asked. Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked again toward Aaliyah, who was now assisting another guest with the same consistency, the same absence of hesitation, the same quiet precision that no longer felt incidental. Nothing changed in her behavior, Richard said. Only in my perception of it. Daniel followed his gaze again, this time more slowly. "And what do you see now?" he asked. Richard paused for a longer moment than before. The restaurant continued its steady rhythm around them, but the table between the two men had become a space of reflection rather than exchange. "I see that competence does not require permission to exist," Richard said finally. Daniel did not respond immediately. The statement carried weight not because it was complex, but because it removed the simplicity of earlier assumptions. Across the room, Aaliyah completed her interaction and moved toward another table without interruption, without acknowledgement of the attention now directed toward her. Richard observed this quietly, recognizing not performance but continuity. "You are saying you misjudged her completely," Daniel said. Richard did not correct him. Instead, he chose precision over agreement. "I am saying I did not have enough information to make any judgment at all," he replied. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if the distinction itself required reconsideration. The conversation paused again, not because it ended, but because it had reached a point where further simplification was no longer possible. Richard remained focused on Aaliyah's movements across the room, no longer as a subject of evaluation, but as a reference point for understanding the limits of his own assumptions. And in that realization, the distance between observation and understanding no longer felt like a detail, but like the entire structure he had been relying on without question. The final stretch of the evening carried a different kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of reflection that neither Richard Whitmore nor Daniel Brooks attempted to interrupt. The restaurant had nearly reached its closing rhythm, with staff moving in slower, more deliberate patterns, yet Richard remained seated as if leaving would interrupt a process still unfolding in his mind. Across the room, Aaliyah Johnson continued her work with the same steady precision, but for Richard, she was no longer simply part of the environment. She had become a reference point against which his assumptions were being quietly dismantled and rebuilt. Daniel broke the silence first, his voice lower now, less analytical and more reflective. "You have not looked at your phone once in the last 30 minutes, he said. Richard did not respond immediately. His attention was still directed toward Aaliyah as she finished assisting a table, and moved with controlled efficiency toward another section of the floor. "There was nothing in it that required my attention," Richard said finally. Daniel gave a faint, almost uncertain smile. "That is not usually how you operate," he replied. Richard acknowledged the observation with a slight nod, but did not dispute it. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture less rigid than earlier in the evening. "What I usually operate on," he said, "depends on the assumption that information has already been correctly filtered before it reaches me." Daniel studied him for a moment. "And tonight you think that assumption is wrong," he said. Richard did not answer immediately. The restaurant's ambient noise continued around them, but their table remained isolated in its own quiet focus. Across the room, Aaliyah paused briefly at the service station, speaking softly with another staff member before continuing her route. "I think the assumption is incomplete," Richard said finally. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "That sounds like a safer way of saying you were wrong." Richard allowed a brief pause before responding. "Being wrong implies closure," he said. "This is not closure. It is recognition of missing context." Daniel leaned back, absorbing the distinction. The earlier skepticism in his expression had softened into something more contemplative. "So what do you do with that recognition?" he asked. Richard's gaze followed Aaliyah as she moved once again across the dining floor, assisting a guest with the same calm consistency she had maintained throughout the evening. "You adjust the framework," Richard said. "You stop treating interpretation as certainty." Daniel exhaled slowly, as if the idea itself required reconsideration. "That is a significant shift for one evening," he said. Richard finally turned his attention back to the table. "It is not the evening that created the shift," he replied. "It is the exposure of how little verification I actually applied before forming conclusions." Daniel did not respond immediately. The conversation between them had moved beyond casual commentary and into something more structural, less about Aaliyah directly and more about the way perception itself had been operating. Across the room, Aaliyah completed another interaction and briefly glanced toward the service counter, her expression unchanged, her focus steady. Richard observed this quietly, no longer analyzing her actions as anomalies, but recognizing them as consistent behavior that had simply not aligned with his expectations earlier. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice more subdued. Most people would not spend this much time reconsidering a single interaction, he said. Richard gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. Most people do not rely on their interpretations to guide decisions at scale, he replied. A brief silence followed. Not empty but resolved in a different direction. Richard looked once more across the room, not with evaluation, but with a form of restraint that had not been present when the evening began. The problem, he said quietly, is not what I saw. It is what I assumed I did not need to question. And in that statement, the distance between certainty and understanding no longer felt theoretical, but immediate, present, and unresolved.